Picture this: a marble courtyard, the air thick with incense, sweet and suffocating. The columns cast long shadows across the stone floor. A boy stands barefoot, his frame small, his eyes wide. He's no older than 8. Beside him, an old man draped in linen places a firm hand on his shoulder and whispers about virtue. This is how philosophy began, not in libraries, not in lecture halls, but in shadows, in rooms where the line between mentor and master disappeared, where silence was the price of brilliance. We're taught to revere these men, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. They're the pillars of reason, the fathers of thought. Their words still shape our laws, our ethics, our education. And yet, these same men believed that the body of a boy was a vessel for enlightenment. They didn't just write about beauty, they touched it. They didn't just teach logic, they bent it to justify something they could never say aloud, but did anyway, over and over again. In Athens it had a name, paiderastia, a tradition, a ritual, a philosophical bond between an adult man and a preteen boy, sanctioned, celebrated, and carved into the very stones of the city. So now I ask you, what if the birth of philosophy was also the birth of something darker? What if the men who defined virtue used it to mask their own obsession? Can you separate the ideas from the man who whispered them into the ear of a child? Because this isn't just another story of strange customs, this is one of the most disturbing contradictions in human history. The men who created morality were quietly erasing their victims. Before we begin, tell us where you're listening from. These forgotten truths deserve to echo far beyond the temples they were buried in. Like, share, or just breathe through this with us. Because what you're about to hear won't leave you easily. We've been sold a lie. When people talk about ancient Greece, they speak with reverence, white marble temples, wise men in robes, democracy, freedom, the birthplace of civilization. But Athens wasn't what you think. It was a city of contradictions, where philosophical truth was built atop human silence, where men debated virtue in one breath and in the next claimed a child as property. The streets bustled with art and rhetoric, and with slaves. 1/3 of the population was owned. Women weren't citizens, they were shadows, married off at 13, hidden from public life, voiceless, and boys. Boys were gifted, not to play, but to serve. At the heart of this disturbing society was a tradition so normalized, so sacred that no one questioned it. Paiderastia, a tradition they spoke of with pride, a bond made part of their culture. It was described as a connection between an older teacher, called the Erasts, and a younger student, called the Eromenos. They didn't hide it. They included it in their praise. The man was expected to educate, protect, and love the boy, spiritually, intellectually, and physically. This wasn't scandal. It was honour. While women were locked behind high stone walls, boys were paraded, shown off at festivals, decorated with garlands, dressed in gold-trimmed tunics, brought to banquets, symposia, where philosophers drank wine and recited poems about the curve of a boy's back. These weren't hidden chambers. These were institutions of learning. In the wrestling schools, boys trained nude, not for efficiency, but for observation. Older men stood on the edges of the sandpit, watching, commenting, choosing. Touch was instruction. Endurance was praised. Silence was required. Statues captured it. Poets immortalized it. Laws protected it. It was said that the love of a boy inspired virtue, that to gaze upon him with desire was to feel the divine, that this relationship taught ethics, because if a man could restrain himself, he had mastered control, and if he couldn't, well, they found ways to rationalize that too. The most disturbing part? The rules weren't about protecting the child, they were about preserving reputation. The boy must not appear willing, he must not speak out, he must not resist, but he must also not enjoy, because if he did, he was shamed, marked, cast out as dishonourable. And when he grew older, he was expected to repeat the cycle, to choose a boy of his own, to pass down the tradition masked as mentorship. This was the world of Socrates, of Plato, of Aristotle, the world they didn't just live in, but wrote about, defended, and helped codify. So next time you walk through the ruins of Athens, remember this: the very stones of the Acropolis have heard the laughter of boys who didn't yet know they were being studied. But what happens when the teacher of ethics becomes the architect of obsession? They called them teachers, mentors, philosophers, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, the guardians of reason, the sculptors of the Western mind. But behind their teachings was something far more intimate and far more disturbing. Because in ancient Athens, philosophy wasn't just a discipline, it was a relationship. One that often began with a boy, barely in his second decade of life, and a man twice his age. This wasn't private, it wasn't secret, it was celebrated. The ideal philosopher didn't just study beauty, he pursued it, in flesh. These relationships had rules, they had rituals, and they had names. The boy was the eromenos, the beloved. The man was the erasts, the lover, the guide, the master. And what was passed between them wasn't just knowledge, it was expectation, it was access, it was control. They called it a moral bond. But there was nothing moral about it. Socrates, the man who questioned everything, never questioned this. He was known for his young companions, for his poetic admiration of adolescent boys, for his long, late-night conversations that blurred the lines between teaching and touching. He believed the soul could be awakened through love, but he also believed love began with beauty, and beauty to him looked like a smooth-faced boy sitting quietly at his side. One of his most famous students, Alcibiades, later revealed in Plato's Symposium that Socrates would invite him to lie beside him, naked, unmoving, untouched technically, but completely dominated. Because the body wasn't the only thing being moulded, it was the mind, the boy's need for approval, his craving for attention, his confusion between love and loyalty, between intimacy and submission. Socrates was a master not of seduction, but of design. He would let desire simmer, let the boy's thoughts twist in upon themselves, until resistance became reverence. And then there was Plato, the man who took Socratic obsession and gave it language, gave it structure. In the Phaedrus and Symposium he laid out a roadmap. Love begins with the body, then ascends to the soul, then reaches the divine. He called it divine madness, a noble path, an education through beauty. But beauty to Plato was not abstract. It was always embodied. It was always youthful. It was always male. And it always ended before the boy became a man. Plato insisted that the best love was chaste, that true wisdom didn't involve physical touch, but he also romanticized the gaze, the longing, the hunger. He glorified the torment of restraint, without ever questioning why the desire existed in the first place. It wasn't about resisting temptation. It was about being praised for not acting on it, even while cultivating it. Then came Aristotle, the rationalist, the one who gave structure to everything: biology, politics, ethics, even desire. He didn't write poems about boys, he wrote justifications. In his Politics, Aristotle defended relationships with boys as a natural phase of male development, a temporary attraction that prepared men for the lesser duty of heterosexual marriage. He believed women were inherently inferior, that they lacked the moral and intellectual depth of men. So why love a woman when a boy's silence could be shaped into perfection? Aristotle believed in utility, that everything had a purpose, and in this world, boys were tools to refine character, to explore dominance, to delay responsibility. What united these men wasn't just brilliance, it was entitlement. Entitlement to the bodies they praised, to the silence they expected, to the traditions they never questioned because they benefited from them. They turned exploitation into ethics, turned grooming into virtue, and turned victims into vessels. This was the hidden syllabus of ancient philosophy, not just to question the world, but to reshape it around their desire. And so, in a society that worshipped the mind, they reached for the most impressionable ones they could find. Not to listen, but to be listened to. Not to teach, but to imprint. Not to love, but to mould. These were the teachers of virtue, and their greatest lesson was how easily wisdom can be used to excuse obsession. The man who questioned everything except himself. He was called the wisest man in Athens, but his wisdom didn't come from books. It came from the streets, from wandering barefoot through the marketplace, from speaking in riddles, from watching boys. He never wrote a word. Everything we know about him comes from others, mostly from his most devoted admirer, Plato. And through Plato's words, we see the man, not just as a philosopher, but as a presence, a gaze, a silence that made you listen harder. To the people of Athens, Socrates was a mystery. He didn't charge money, he didn't dress like a scholar. But boys followed him, listened to him, worshipped him. He attracted the sons of generals, of statesmen, of poets. They weren't forced, they came willingly, which made it easier to forget that they were still children. He taught them how to question, how to speak, how to submit to thought, and sometimes how to lie beside him. One of the most famous stories comes from Plato's Symposium. A drunken young man named Alcibiades crashes a banquet and begins to speak. Not to the guests, but to Socrates. He describes a night when they shared a bed. Alcibiades, barely more than a boy, offered himself to his teacher, laid next to him, heart pounding, waiting, wanting. And Socrates, he did nothing. He simply lay there, quiet, unmoving, awake. Alcibiades called it restraint, called it proof of purity. But think for a moment. What happens to a child who offers themselves to someone they idolize and is neither accepted nor rejected? What kind of confusion is that? What kind of power? This was Socrates' specialty. He didn't dominate with force, he dominated with awe. He praised beauty in theory, and then stared at it in silence. He claimed chastity, and then invited proximity. He disarmed his victims not with action, but with delay. He told his boys that love must begin with beauty, and beauty to Socrates was the body of a boy. He said the soul could be guided upward. But first, the eyes had to wander. First, the desire had to burn. It was a game, a test of control, a ritual of grooming wrapped in the language of enlightenment. Can a man be innocent if he sets the fire but never strikes the match? Can you call it virtue when silence is used to breed compliance? Because Socrates was never accused, never punished, never exposed. He was too careful, too revered, too untouchable. And what about Alcibiades? The boy who once lay beside his teacher became a man who betrayed his city, defected to enemies, changed sides more than once, drank too much, loved too wildly, died too young. History calls him reckless, volatile, madam. But maybe he was just a boy who learned early that love was a trick, that devotion meant obedience, and that silence was a form of survival. Socrates taught Athens how to think, but he also taught boys how to bend, not just their arguments, but their boundaries. He turned emotional dependence into a moral lesson. He made proximity sacred, and in doing so, he made exploitation invisible. This is the father of Western philosophy, a man who questioned everything, except the culture that gave him access, except the boys who followed him, except the power he carried in every whisper, in every pause, in every bed he lay in with open eyes and unmoving hands. If Socrates laid the foundation, Plato built the temple. He took the silence, the ritual, the power, and gave it language, structure, elevation. He called it love, but only in the way a philosopher would: abstract, noble, untouchable, at least in theory. Plato's remembered as the idealist, the man who believed in perfect forms, perfect justice, perfect beauty. The mind, he said, must rise above the body, the soul must ascend, but in practice, that ascent always began with a boy. In the Phaedrus, Plato describes the journey of the soul, how it once soared with the gods gazing at truth itself, and how, in life, it longs to return to that place. But how does it begin the return? By falling in love with the body of a beautiful boy. Plato believed that this attraction, this fire of desire, was a gift, a divine madness, the soul remembering what it once knew. He said the lover should not act on it, that true love does not touch, that the highest connection is one of minds, not bodies. But that didn't stop him from staring. In the Symposium, Plato offers a banquet of ideas. Each guest delivers a speech on love. Some are tender, some are grotesque, but all agree on one thing: the love of boys is the noblest kind. They speak of it as sacred, as the gateway to wisdom, as the proper training for becoming a philosopher. And yet, even in these dialogues that warn against lust, you'll find an undercurrent of obsession, of longing, because Plato couldn't quite escape the culture that made him. He wanted love to be pure, but purity was defined on his terms where the boy must be beautiful, silent, receptive, where the man must burn with passion, but never act, and if he did, there was always a poem, a metaphor, a way to make it seem transcendent. Can you hear the contradiction? He condemned the body, but worshipped its shape. He scorned physical pleasure, but wrote about the glow of youthful skin. He claimed to protect the boy, but romanticized the gaze that pinned him in place. Plato's love was not physical, but it was not innocent. Imagine a boy, 12 years old, escorted to a symposium, dressed in fine linen, perfumed, taught how to serve wine, surrounded by grown men quoting verses about his eyelashes, smiling at him, judging him, praising him if he stays silent. One of them tells him that love is sacred, another tells him that beauty is power, a third says that his presence is a gift to the soul. He doesn't understand, but he smiles, because that's what he was taught to do. Plato wanted to rise above desire, but he wrote entire dialogues that orbit around it. And the tragedy is this: he believed he was protecting the boy, but he never asked him what protection looked like. He only asked him to remain still. If Plato tried to rise above desire, Aristotle brought it back to earth. He didn't write in riddles. He didn't speak of divine madness or the soul's ascent. He dealt in categories, logic, structure, nature. And in that nature, he found justification for things most wouldn't dare explain. Aristotle saw the world as a hierarchy: men above women, Greeks above barbarians, reason above emotion, and boys, somewhere between child and man, as tools for training virtue. In his politics, he refers to paiderastia as a natural stage of male development, a temporary attraction, a phase to be explored before settling into the less noble act of marriage with a woman. He didn't glorify love, he analysed it, broke it down, measured it, then defended it. To Aristotle, there was nothing shameful about a man being drawn to a boy, so long as it was useful, so long as it preserved control, so long as the boy remained passive and silent. This wasn't philosophy as we know it. This was biological entitlement, justified by charts and syllogisms. He believed women were incomplete men, cold, irrational, lacking the fire of intellect. They existed to reproduce, to obey. But boys? Boys had potential. They could be shaped, moulded, used. In his eyes, a boy's beauty wasn't just an accident of youth. It was a resource. Imagine the cold detachment it takes to write about desire as if it were a mathematical principle, to turn pleasure into philosophy, to reduce the trembling of a boy's hand into a natural response to order. No emotion, no empathy, just reason. And that's what made Aristotle dangerous, because his brilliance wasn't in the shadows. It was in the justification, in the system, in the mask of logic that made cruelty sound civilized. In a world where Plato longed for the divine, Aristotle was content with the permissible. What could be defended? What could be explained? Even if it could never be excused. They never wrote down his name, not once, not in the dialogues, not in the speeches, not in the scrolls that praised his beauty. He was just the boy, the Eromenos, the beloved, not for who he was, but for what he gave. Silence, obedience, a face that made the gods weep. Or so they said. They immortalized the philosopher, but the boy, he was erased in the very texts he inspired. So today, we imagine him, not as a symbol, but as a child. He is 12, small for his age. His robe is stiff with embroidery. He's been told to keep it clean, to walk straight, to speak only when spoken to never question why a man twice his age keeps calling him beautiful. His parents call it nonna. His tutor says it's tradition. The other boys joke about who will be chosen next. No one says the word choice. Because there isn't one. He's led to the symposium. His feet are bare, his lips stained with diluted wine. He pours for men who speak in metaphors about how his shoulders carry the soul of the city. He doesn't understand the poems, but he understands the gaze. He's told this is how you learn. This is how boys become men. Through touch, through trust, through knowing when not to flinch. And when he's alone with his mentor, his philosopher, his guide, his shadow, the lessons become quieter, slower. The questions come softly. Do you know how lucky you are? Do you feel it too? This is love, the pure kind. But it doesn't feel pure. It feels like weight, like something slipping under his skin that he was never taught to name. He learns not to cry, not because it hurts, but because no one would listen if it did. He learns to nod, to look down, to smile in the way that pleases grown men. He learns that knowledge isn't something you ask for. It's something that takes from you. And when the philosopher moves on, chooses another boy, writes another dialogue, the child is left behind. Older maybe, but not whole, not wiser. Just hollow in places no one sees. He becomes a man who doesn't look back. Or maybe he becomes the next mentor, the next guide, repeating the tradition because he was never shown how to break it. This is the boy behind the philosophy, not carved in marble, not quoted in textbooks, but shaped just the same. He wasn't taught how to think. He was taught how to surrender, and they called it education. They called it love. They called it enlightenment. But for him, it was a lesson in vanishing. We've called it philosophy, a legacy of wisdom, the beginning of ethics, the foundation of the Western world. But when you strip away the marble statues, the eloquent dialogues, the glowing words carved into the walls of academia, what's left? A man, a boy, and silence. They called it mentorship. They said admiration for beauty led to care for the soul, that certain teachings required closeness. But wisdom was never meant to feel like silence. Knowledge never needed a child to sit quietly while a teacher spoke of discipline. No lesson required boys to stay near older men in the name of character. It didn't need wine-soaked gatherings, physical drills, or lingering glances. So what were they truly passing down? That obedience is virtue, that silence is consent, that power cloaked in reason becomes righteousness. Because the horror isn't just what they did, it's what they called it. Love, education, tradition. They took exploitation and made it sacred. In ancient Greece, boys were not protected. They were prepared, conditioned to believe that their worth was in how much they endured, how well they performed, how gracefully they carried someone else's desire on their shoulders, and we, thousands of years later, still quote the men who built that system without ever asking what else they built with it. So no, this wasn't just culture, this wasn't just custom, this was a philosophy of entitlement, a doctrine dressed in robes that taught powerful men how to turn curiosity into control, admiration into possession, and brilliance into absolution. You can call it Greek tradition, you can call it paideia, paiderasty, mentorship. But it was always about the same thing. Who gets to shape the world, and who is told to stay quiet while it happens? They called it love, they called it virtue, they called it philosophy, and we believed them. Because the men who said it were geniuses, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. They shaped the language we use to describe what's good. They gave us logic, democracy, ethics. But they also gave us something else, something far more enduring, a blueprint, a way to cloak power in poetry, to turn harm into holiness, to justify desire, so long as it's spoken with enough elegance. We still quote them, still elevate them, still treat their words like scripture. But we rarely ask what those words cost, or who paid the price for them. What happens when brilliance becomes a shield, when reputation silences the victim, when the echo of genius drowns out the whisper of a child? This isn't just about ancient Greece, it never was. This is about what we choose to remember and what we're willing to forget, about how easily history folds silence into its pages, and how often abuse hides behind the mask of enlightenment. They taught us how to think, but they also taught us how to look away. So ask yourself, can you truly separate the brilliance from the body it stood on? Can you celebrate the philosopher and ignore the boy who never got to speak? Can you love the wisdom without naming the wound it was written on? Because in the end, they didn't bury these boys, they erased them. And the only thing they left behind was the family crest of philosophy, hammered in gold, to honour the bloodline of genius and silence everything else.